You're good to start at your speed whenever you want.
Okay. Well, it was a day like any other day, like so many days in the war. The sun had come up, that was sure to go down, but then the colonel interrupted it by calling for a formation. And your first thought is, well, what's he going to tell us today? Something we're doing wrong, or somebody going to be the new commanding officer, or what? So we all lined up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon with clean clothes on. And he announced to us, and we were to be privileged and honored by being part of the first group to go back to the Philippines to make good on MacArthur's promise that he would return. Well, this was going to be the first real invasion for us from the very, very beginning on. It would mean that we'd probably be put on board a LST instead of some Liberty ship. The last time I was on a Liberty ship, I'd gotten a case of claustrophobia because we were sleeping in a wide opening at a temperature of 110 degrees below deck, and 6 guys deep, only one light that was on the stairway going up. So I immediately began to wonder about what sort of accommodations I'd get on board an LST. And I finally doped out that I was going to sleep on deck. And what I'd take with me is my cot and my jungle hammock, and somehow managed to string the jungle hammock from a truck to the railing maybe, and sleep there. So after a tremendous effort to load the LST in a sea that was rampaging, we took off for Hollandia, and there, surrounded by thousands of ships. We waited for about a week, and then we took off for Leyte. Finally, the day arrived that we were to go in. A+2. It was called A Day, I guess, to make sure it didn't get mixed up with Europe. And it was D-Day. And I was lying in my bunk, and the sun was just, I looked out, and there was a battleship going by, going in the direction. And pretty soon, 5 more battleships went past me. And these are old ships. I knew that from picture books I had at home, that these things were probably built back around 1914 or something. Old ships. What I didn't know at the time, but I did learn later, was that 5 of these 6 battleships had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, or badly damaged. And now here they were back in service again. Of course, this time they've been outfitted with radar and some very fine gunnery devices. So anyhow, we steamed on, and we came ashore near Tacloban on Leyte, and went into position. We had air raids, quite a few of them. One of the raids I heard later was 150 aircraft, 50 of which had engine trouble coming down, and 50 of which were shot down en route, and then the other 50 came over our heads and got shot down up there. The first day or two at Leyte was just about that. It was finding out that your anti-aircraft shells don't disappear in the air, they come down if they don't go off the stairs. We had a lot of flak coming through the area. And finally, one afternoon, I think it was about the 3rd day we were there, a kid in the outfit went down to get water. He was our truck driver for our section. And when he came back, he said, "Hill, something's gone wrong. Our airplanes are coming in and crashing on the airstrip, which isn't completed." Well, I think out of all the experiences I had during the war, I had one of the worst ones then. Because in the pit of my stomach, I suddenly recalled just how far we were from our old base. We'd come at least 5 times the distance that the soldiers for the invasion of Normandy had traveled. The ones who traveled the furthest had traveled. We had traveled something like 1,500 miles to come to Leyte. If something was going wrong with the Navy, we could be left on Leyte for an indefinite period and probably would end up as prisoners of the Japs. And nobody wanted that, nobody. So anyway, I kept thought to myself, if our planes are coming in crashing, that means a carrier's been sunk somewhere. What is going on? Well, what was going on was the execution of a really excellent Japanese plan. To illustrate that best, I think we'll have a cutoff in there and
Yeah.
diagram, so forth.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
whenever you can take time and make the diagram whenever you want to make it.
The plan worked perfectly.
You can picture it in your head. Just
Huh?
describe the diagram now.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay.
And then if you picture it, and then later we can draw it based on what you said and illustrate what you talked about.
Fundamentally, there were these 3 different segments to the battle. Mindanao in the south, Leyte and Samar in the middle, and Luzon in the north. Now the Japanese plan called for tricking Halsey into leaving the beachhead, which he was to defend, by putting 4 carriers into a force coming down the east side of Luzon. They knew they would get Halsey to go dashing north to get those carriers. He did exactly that. In the meantime, another force was coming around the west side of Luzon and going through the San Bernardino Strait, which lies between Luzon and Samar. Now, from what I read, the U.S. Navy was doubtful that battleships could get through this passageway, but the Japanese had taken it to trouble to find out that it could, if they were carefully navigated. That force was to turn down and attack our shipping, or the landing area that we'd come in on, where our supplies were stashed and where many of our supply ships were located. Another force coming from Singapore was to come up to the Surigao Strait, which lies between Leyte and Mindanao. And this force would help the force that came down from San Bernardino. The 2 of them were to link up there in our backyard, so to speak. Well, a force that was supposed to get through the San Bernardino Strait and into heavy air attack, Halsey sitting off the beachhead pounded them. And the Japanese lost one of their 2 gigantic battleships, the Musashi. Musashi weighed 60,000 tons and had 18-inch guns on board. American naval forces usually had 16-inch. The loss of the Musashi was not enough to stop the Japanese. They kept coming. But finally, the bombardment of the other large battleship, the Yamato, caused the Japanese to turn tail and go back to the San Bernardino Strait. This gave Halsey the impression Japanese in the central area of the battle had turned tail and were retreating. And he felt totally free to go chasing after the 4 Japanese carriers. What Halsey, of course, did not know was that the Japanese had no aircraft on those carriers. They had lost their naval air arm in the Battle of the Marianas, which was called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. So they were quite willing to sacrifice 4 carriers to get Halsey to come up north and let that force get to the center. One of the reasons that Halsey was so anxious to charge after the Japanese carriers was that practically all of his experience in the South Pacific, he was up against a tactical obstacle that if the Japanese held an island and we were to attack it, the Japanese were able to come in with a carrier force and fly to his fleet at a great range when we were attacking for refueling and more ammunition. Whereas Halsey would have had to have flown a great distance to get to the Japanese carriers. They could stand off slightly beyond his range and attack him without being attacked. So he dashed after the Japanese carriers, and the attack fleet that was going after a beachhead turned circuit again and came back through the San Bernardino Strait and began to proceed toward our supply ships. On their way, they encountered several carriers, smaller carriers, not fleet-sized carriers, but small carriers, and sunk them. And these are the planes our fellow who'd gone to the water depot saw landing at Tacloban and crashing into the jungle because the airstrip wasn't complete. About that time, the order came down to our unit to turn our guns around and face the sea. Now we were located in a position, a few miles off the beach, and between us and the water were swamp and coconut trees. If we had gone into action against the Armado and the rest of the fleet, we couldn't have seen them. We'd have to been shooting blindly, or there was no direct opportunity to make a direct lay from the guns to the Armado. Whereas the Armado, of course, would have centrally controlled gunfire. And I'm afraid that had we had to engage them, it would have been a disaster. In order to get our guns turned around, we had the problem of the time interval it would take to up and get the spades out from underneath the trails of the gun so that they could be swung around. It was decided that we didn't have time to do that, so tractors were hitched up to the gun trails and they tried to drag them around in a position to fire out to sea. And this was an absolute disaster. No time at all, the guns were mired in the muck, and I don't think we could have fired at the Japanese if we wanted to. In the meantime, the Navy, and this was actually the part of the Navy that was dedicated to making the landing, the supply ships, and defensive supply ships, and things like that, did what they could to stop the Japanese fleet. 4 destroyers attacked the Japanese fleet, 3 of which were sunk outright by making very gallant charges. The aircraft from the remaining, were still in the air from the Russ carriers, made buzzing runs at the Japanese. Actually, the ships at the naval aircraft that was there at the time was not meant for combat of this type. It had other operations that it was supposed to perform, such as preparation support for landing or things of that nature. The guns they had, the type of ammunition were not correct. But they buzzed the Japanese fleet and rattled the commanders. And the commander of the Japanese fleet made a mistake as a result of this harassment. And his group had not formed up yet for the attack on our supply lines. And he gave them the order to engage the enemy, which left them no particular instructions on how to form up. And the Japanese ships got rather disorganized. With the harassment he was taking, for some reason, and I think the loss of the Musashi may have been part of it, he decided that he should retreat. Of course, another factor in the thing was that he did not see any of his friends that were coming from Singapore. So he felt possibly he was moving his Japanese fleet into a trap. They turned around and turned tail and left. So by 2 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, the pressure was off. What had happened the night before involved the 6 battleships that I had seen. They had met the Japanese at the Surigao Strait, and the 3 fleets that were coming from Singapore were heavy cruiser fleets, and they walked into a trap. First of all, they were hit by destroyers firing torpedoes, then PT boats attacked them, and ultimately they ran into the 6 battleships which were cruising back and forth over the Surigao Straits with their brand new radar sensing artillery fire. So that is why Admiral Kurita, when he was looking for help from the south, didn't see any of it. The entire Jap fleet there was simply blocked, if not totally sunk. Anyway, that day came to an end without any particular knowledge on our part that something had been accomplished. We continued to be hit with aircraft coming from the island of Cebu and from Luzon. And our supply situation, we were still living off the 30 days rations that we brought from New Guinea with us. Sitting in front of us, in front of our guns, was 6,000 rounds of artillery shells that we brought, plus 60 days supply of gasoline, oil. It wasn't until I got orders to move out of that general area, felt that something had been accomplished. And we certainly had enough nights there to worry about getting hit with tracer bullets that were meant for airplanes. And the Japanese at one point in time did make a counterattack that took over a house on our right flank. And we had to sit there. We had one thing we usually did have was telephone lines strung from each machine gun nest to another. I remember that night we don't shoot, they still got the Filipinos in there. And finally the word came down that Filipinos are out. Fire. And boy, we blew the hell out of that house. we did make one other great discovery in that location. We began to cut down coconut trees to make it possible for us to bring our gun barrels down lower and give closer support to the infantry. And after we'd felled the first one, there was this peculiar odor. It was a little bit like beer, maybe stale beer. And as we discovered that there were bamboo tubes so long that were hanging from some of the fronds on the top of the tree. And that's where the odor was. And it smelled awfully good. And we started to drink it. Well, there was a process to making this substance called tuba. And one of the first things that happened was it had to ferment up in the top of a tree. If you drank it before certain leaves were added to it, the juice of certain leaves, it served principally as a physic. And a lot of fellows came to regret their experimentation with that. But that was about as much fun as we had in the town of Pauline, as it was called, where we were located. But one thing else. In the invasion, 1st Cavalry Division was supposed to go to attack Laban. We were supposed to follow the 24th in and go to Pauline. Somehow the 24th got into trouble on the beach. They may have hit a stronger line of Japanese. They couldn't advance inland, and we were forced to change from the beachhead behind them to the beachhead behind the 1st Cav. We came ashore, and there was a Boy Scout statue and a break in the road. The break in the road ran into Tacloban one way and out to what was going to be the airstrip the other way. As we drove down toward Pauline on this new route, the 1st Cav had made a spurt to the south, was coming back, and it captured a brewery. And friendly fellows that they were tossing cases of beer at us as we drove down the road. Anyway, we went into position at Pauline, and the question came up, well, should we dig a foxhole or not tonight? The hell with it. You know, why dig a hole? Japs don't know we're here. Yeah. So we didn't dig in. The next morning, coming through the area of the High Port was the 24th Division Infantry. Maneuvering the way we had, we'd end up about a mile behind Japanese lines. We were very fortunate that they didn't catch us in those hammocks, because all they had to do was flip you in a hammock. Then they use you for bayonet practice. But that's about the story of the first 5 days on Leyte.